Hello and welcome to this virtual town hall on Jamaica's watershed policy being put on by the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. I'm your moderator, Dion Jacksmiller, and I'm a country girl. So when one of my daughter's friends came to the house, glanced into the laundry room and saw buckets and buckets of water, his mouth dropped open and he said, "Why do you all have these buckets of water?" And my daughter's answer, quite correctly, was, "My mother come from country." So yes, indeed I do. And having lived in two separate parishes with water problems, one of the first things I do when I move into a house is to fill up my buckets of water. So you can imagine my shock working in the newsroom in Kingston one day, answering the phone to have a gentleman say, "He's from Mona, he has a problem." My ears prick up because it sounds like a story. The gentleman said, "We haven't had water for 4 hours." I said, "You're not in a bucket." He was not amused. He said, "Miss." I said, "Sir, what you need to do is go down to the hardware store, buy some bucket, and fill them up." He was not amused. Now, I'm saying this not to say, of course, that these problems were necessarily due to watershed issues, but that over the past few years, I think all of us, those from country as well as those of us in town, understand what it's like not to have any water in the pipes, and we understand the importance of protecting our sources of water and our watersheds in a changing climate. So therefore, I am so happy and so excited to be participating and moderating this town hall on this very critical document, because watershed management is one of the critical steps we have to take to protect ourselves as the climate continues to change. This virtual town hall has two objectives. One, to generally raise awareness of watershed issues and watershed management and the policy, and also to get feedback from you, honest and authentic feedback. So welcome to those of you watching on YouTube, on Facebook. We welcome your comments and your questions. No, more than that. Please send in your comments and your questions, because all those comments and questions and information will feed into improving this policy. Now you're going to be hearing from the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. You'll be hearing from the Water Resources Authority, the National Environment and Protection Agency, the Forestry Division, the Forestry Department as well. And I know when you have all these technical experts in a room, it's very tempting to ask all the questions that you have, such as, why I go home nighttime and there's no water in my pipe. So I'm asking you, though, to hold strain. We want to focus this discussion very tightly on the watershed policy. So we welcome, as I said, your comments as we go through the evening. Now let's first start out by asking Mr. Cleon Williams to bring us some remarks. He's advisor to the Minister without portfolio in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, Senator Matthew Samuda, and he'll be sharing with us some thoughts from the Minister, who is unavoidably absent.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to the viewers. Good afternoon to the panel, and since I'm the first speaker, let me just do the fancy bits. Mrs. Dion Jackson-Miller, moderator, the Honorable Audrey Sewell, OJCDJP, Permanent Secretary at MEGJC, Ms. Gillian Guthrie, Chief Technical Director also at MEGJC, Mr. Jeffrey Marshall, JP, Deputy Managing Director of the WRA, Mrs. Alicia Edwards, Senior Director, Forest Resource Information Management Branch, Forestry Department, Mr. Andre Reed, Coordinator, Watershed Area Management at NEPA, and of course, Mr. Ainsley Henry, who is the CEO of the Forestry Department, media, online audience, and other special invited guests. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and I welcome you to the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation's Town Hall meeting on the draft Watersheds policy. This public consultation on the draft Watersheds policy has come at an opportune time as Jamaica, and indeed the global community, continues to grapple with the effects of climate change and its existential threats, including high temperatures and extreme weather events such as droughts. Indeed, the most recent and preliminary analysis of rainfall data collected by the Met Service for the month of June shows that some sections of most parishes recorded above normal rainfall. However, some parts of Portland, St. Mary, Westmoreland, and St. Elizabeth are a few exceptions, as they have been experiencing a deficit in rainfall. It should be noted that with the higher than normal temperatures being experienced across the island, the moisture loss would be enhanced, and this would be problematic, especially to the farming communities. This highlights the importance of healthy and fully functional watersheds in providing critical ecosystems, goods and services such as climate mitigation, clean air and water, mitigation of flood risk, erosion, sedimentation control, and habitats for conserving biological resources. Jamaica is home to 26 watersheds, and they all play a vital role in supporting key economic sectors such as agriculture, tourism, and industry. However, several of the island's watersheds show signs of degradation, which can hurt the long-term productivity of lands as well as the quality and quantity of our water resources. During this town hall meeting, presentations will be made by the Water Resources Authority, the National Environment and Planning Agency, and the Forestry Department on the state of the island's hydrological basins and forest cover. These are two critical components of watersheds. The watersheds policy was developed to frontally address many of the economic, social, and environmental issues and concerns affecting our watersheds. The Cabinet approved the draft policy as a green paper and presented it in the House of Parliament in March 2023. It prescribes inter alia the governance and instructional framework necessary for integral watershed management. It also outlines provisions for engaging communities and other key stakeholders central to the protection of these vital areas. The fundamental goals of this policy are to enhance sustainable watershed management practices and foster awareness among Jamaicans regarding the significance of watersheds and promote active participation in their conservation efforts. Preserving the ecological function and integrity of our island's watersheds is of utmost importance. It is through our collective efforts and decisive actions that we can ensure these ecosystems continue to provide essential functions and services that sustain our lives and livelihoods. Water is an essential element for the survival and well-being of all living beings. It is an invaluable and finite resource that holds immense significance in maintaining life, supporting communities, and fueling economic growth and development. Regrettably, we often fail to recognize the urgent need to conserve and efficiently utilize this precious commodity. To tackle these challenges effectively, it is imperative to streamline our legislative and instructional frameworks, ensure coherence and efficiency in the management of our watersheds and integrated water resources. In this endeavor, the active involvement of all stakeholders, including the private sector, civil society, and local communities, is paramount. At the community level, meaningful engagement and empowerment are essential in fostering better stewardship of our watersheds. In addition to implementing legislative and institutional measures, it is crucial to prioritize capacity building and knowledge development for effective watershed and water resource management. By fostering collaboration among government agencies, the private sector, research institutions, and other stakeholders, we can cultivate and innovate an evidence-based solution to address the multifaceted challenges at hand. The outcomes of this consultation, coupled with the valuable insight gleaned from previous consultations with the public and private sectors, non-governmental organizations, and academia, will inform the finalization of the draft watersheds policy. During previous consultation sessions, several key issues were raised and discussed, including updating the Watersheds Protection Act 1963 to make it more efficient and responsive to the multiplicity of factors affecting the island's watersheds, ensuring adequate and sustainable finance for effective watershed management, promoting and facilitating sustainable land management practices, strengthening, monitoring, and enforcing regimes targeted at issues related to watershed management, enhancement of the capacities and technological capabilities of the relevant regulatory agencies, as well as communities to support effective watershed management, and proactive and sustained engagement and participation of the population, the youth especially, in watershed management. We must take decisive action and forge partnerships among all stakeholders to conserve and sustainably utilize our water resources. Together, we can drive effective watershed management efforts that ensure the health and resilience of our ecosystems, promote the well-being of our communities, and pave the way for a sustainable future for all. Thank you all for being here today, and I look forward to fruitful discussions and recommendations of practical solutions that will ensure the long-term preservation of our invaluable watersheds for the benefit of current and future generations. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Williams. He made so many great points there. The whole point of community involvement is so critical when you're talking about natural resource management, and I know we're going to get into that a little bit later on. We already have some great questions coming in from people who have managed to go through the watershed policy before this virtual town hall, but we know that many of you may not have had the chance to do so. So the next few presentations are going to set the context for watershed management and the watershed policy, and we'll also have an overview of the policy itself. Let's start with Mr. Jeffrey Marshall, who is the Deputy Managing Director of the Water Resources Authority. He's going to talk to us about the status of Jamaica's hydrological basins. What are those, I hear you asking? Stay tuned.
Thank you very much, Dion. Good evening, everyone. I'll be presenting on the status of Jamaica's hydrologic basins, which will give a brief overview of what the watersheds and basins are from the hydrological perspective. Generally speaking, a watershed is defined as an area that has all areas that have a common outlet for any water or rain or liquid that falls on that land. It all flows to a common outflow point. And so in that sense, the watershed would be any area where if rain falls or water falls on it, it flows over land and eventually comes to that point and flows into the sea or flows into wherever is up gradient of that point. In Jamaica, the various watersheds are grouped into watershed management units by NEPA. And like was said earlier, there are 26 of these watershed management units which are grouped together for management purposes. And then these watershed management units then comprise hydrologic basins, as you see on the screen. And in Jamaica, the Water Resources Authority has classified 10 hydrologic basins, which are further broken down, like we said, into watershed management units. The 10 basins are Blue Mountain South, the Kingston, Rio Cobre, Rio Minho, Black River, Cabarita River, Great River basins, Martha Brae River Basin, the Dry Harbor Mountains Basin, and finally the Blue Mountains North Basins. And so what's important is that each of these basins have multiple watersheds within them, and then the watershed management units are what are used in a wider sense for management purposes by NEPA and the WRA. One thing to keep in mind is that a watershed is defined by the surface drainage, by what happens on the surface from rivers and streams, etc. You may have groundwater moving underneath the various divides. So for example, if you see in the picture, you have a divide where WMU1, the rainfalls, the surface flow goes in one direction, and WMU2, the surface flow goes in another direction. But under the ground, there may be groundwater transfer happening within those basins. So that's something to keep in mind when you look at the general management of water resources. The watershed is based mostly on surface water resources and not groundwater resources. And one of the things that we'll be needing to look at in the future for WRA is to look at any inter-basin or inter-watershed transfers happening with groundwater. But the main focus of watersheds in this particular aspect is indeed for surface water. Of the 26 WMUs that comprise in Jamaica, we see that the majority of flows from them in terms of what the WRA monitors on a historical basis, the greatest flows are coming from the Rio Bueno, White River, or the Dry Harbor Mountains Basin, /WMU. From the Rio Grande WMU and the Black River WMUs are the ones with the greatest percentage of flow at about 13 and 12% respectively for those three. And then the other watersheds have significant contributions as well, especially Martha Brae and the Rio Cobre, and the Martha Brae, Rio Cobre, and the Great River are also having significant flows, but the majority comes from the Rio Bueno, Black River, and Rio Grande. And it should be noted that the Rio Bueno and the Dry Harbor Mountains and the Black River, most of those discharges are coming from groundwater discharges coming from the limestone aquifers, while the Rio Grande is a reflection of the significant rainfall that happens in Portland, or in these teams that you might be able to say that used to happen in Portland as climate may be changing. And from monitoring purposes, the Water Resources Authority has a network of stream flow gauges, as seen on the map, where we monitor the flows monthly of the various rivers in each watershed and WMU. You will see that there are about 57 continuous stream flow stations where it's monitored on a continuous basis by a data logger or stream flow recorder. And then there are about 73 spot measurement sites where they're measured once per month, but there are no long-term gauges there. And then there are also discontinued stations where we used to measure in the past, but for various reasons they've been stopped measuring. Hopefully in the future we'll be able to bring those back online and add new stations that we may be able to have more data on the flow of water in the various watersheds, which will then enable us to have a better idea of how much water may be available for usage by all users of Jamaica. And that is the end of the presentation at this particular time. I thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions on water and water resources in watersheds.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Marshall. All right, so I have two questions for you. How much of Jamaica is covered by forest? And what percentage of Jamaica's forests are managed by the Forestry Department? Now, I don't have no gift basket to give you, but if you do know the answer, feel free to drop it in the chat along with your other questions and comments. And let's see if we can hear the answer in the next presentation, which will be given by Ainsley Henry, who is CEO and Conservator of Forests at the Forestry Department.
Good afternoon, everyone. I acknowledge the head table, and thank you, Mr. Williams, for having done that and saved me the trouble. Ms. Jackson-Miller, thank you very much. And welcome to this presentation to all the viewers out there. All right, we'll start first with a brief overview of the Forestry Department. The Forestry Department, as you're aware, is the lead agency responsible for the sustainable management and conservation of the island's forest resources for the benefit of current and future generations. We manage 117,000 hectares of forests, and through instruments like the National Forest Management and Conservation Plan, the National Mangrove Swamp Forest Management Plan, and clustered forest management plans, we strive to ensure that Jamaica remains the land of wood and water. And how do we do that? By sustainably managing these forests to meet the social, economic, and ecological needs for all Jamaicans. In the Forestry Department, we've identified 6 forest cover categories, which include our closed broadleaf forests, or disturbed broadleaf forests, mangrove forests, and open dry forests. Forest cover contributes to water regulation, soil conservation, water quality maintenance, biodiversity conservation, climate resilience, carbon sequestration, and all of these functions happen regardless of the forest type. Recognizing the essential role of forests in maintaining healthy watersheds, it is therefore vital for effective watershed management and policy making. Whoops, I think I'm bouncing through too fast. All right. So, a quick word on how we assess the state of forests and some key statistics. Generally, the Forestry Department uses a decadal assessment of Jamaica's land use, land cover, starting in 1984 with remote sensing. We identified different categories or classes of use, and in 2013, the 2013 assessment revealed that 40% of the forests, 40% of the island-wide forest cover is categorized as disturbed broadleaf forest, while only 19% is closed broadleaf. Closed broadleaf is our most pristine forest class, and that is a very low figure in the context of the total forest cover. The parishes with the most forest cover are Portland, St. Catherine, St. Anne, and Trelawney, which also coincides with the location of our largest forests reserves, such as the Blue Mountain and the recently declared Cockpit Country Protected Area. You will also notice that the presentation made by WRA recognizes these areas as being the most prolific in terms of the production of water based on the monitoring that is being done. Now, between 1998, when we did one report, and 2013, and the observations made in 2013, we recognized that some 95% of swamp forests had suffered change. Open, dry, short forest cover had also declined significantly. Closed broadleaf forest cover class, which, as I explained before, is our primary and most pristine forest class, also experienced approximately 4% loss. Conversely, we identified a new forest cover class, which we've called secondary forests, and that accounted for our largest category during that period. Now, why do we do all of this? We monitor and we look at land use and land change classes because it allows us to do both management and accountability with respect to our management and husbandry of the nation's forests. It also provides us with information to satisfy international obligations. It allows us to monitor changes and hence take proactive steps to facilitate sound management, and it allows for public awareness. So, assessing Jamaica's land cover and land use, changing approaches. So in 2021, we explored new methods for monitoring Jamaica's forest cover. This approach provided similar science-based decision-making data using a more rapid technique for monitoring our landscape to inform policy choices. Using ownership information as one of the primary parameters, we identified the importance of multi-stakeholder engagement to address diverse perspectives and interests. It also highlighted the main drivers and degradation and regrowth across our landscape. This information can be used to refine our current adaptive management approach, which would implement more flexible policies that can be adjusted based on monitoring and evaluation. So, armed with the best practices, lessons learned from our 2013 assessment, and bolstered by our 2021 explorations, we have developed a hybrid approach which is now being used for 2024 assessments. This new assessment includes findings from ongoing monitoring through our National Forest Inventory and other on-ground verification activities to ensure that we have accurate and updated information on the health and physical status of our forest areas to better guide decision and policy making. Yes, okay. I've skipped a slide, I think. Right. So, with all of that, and our change in landscape and leveraging opportunities, we recognize that the National Forest Management Conservation Plan, which provides for sustainable forest management in the face of climate change, the partnerships with stakeholders through the declaration of private forests, Adopt a Hillside, WRA, NEPA, and NLA, economic restoration of underutilized and post-mined-out lands, and enhanced income generation through agroforestry businesses and other forest-related sectors. We can also help to improve climate resilience and increase ecological functionality. With that, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. You know, these microphone stands were invented by a technician who finally got tired of switching mics between people at Mr. Henry's height and my height. So we have Sheridan Wisdom, who has answered. She said 40% as of 2013 of Jamaica is covered by forests. Let me ask you, Mr. Henry, does she get one of our virtual gift baskets? She does indeed. We'll get right on that. Thank you so much, Sheridan. Okay, now another question for you. What does H2O mean in the context of watershed management? See if you can answer that question before we hear from our next speaker, Anthony Mackenzie, Director of Environmental Management and Conservation Division at the National Environment and Planning Agency.
Ladies and gentlemen, my distinguished colleagues, this presentation this evening sets further the context that we're discussing this evening, that of watershed management. Specifically, I'll be referring to some interventions that have taken place, led by NEPA, of course, in collaboration with a number of other entities relating to watersheds and watersheds management. Now, a definition for watershed was provided by Mr. Marshall, but just to reiterate, if we consider the Rio Cobra, and Rio Cobra has been in the news quite regularly in recent times. Now, the Rio Cobra Watershed Management Unit, so we're talking about areas like up in Glengough, Loidas Vale, all of that area is a part of the Rio Cobra Watershed Unit, Linstead, Ewaton, even coming down to Grange Lane, just beside Portmore. That area that forms the land area that's drained by the Rio Cobra, the Watershed Management Unit. Now, watershed management is important. It's critical, as a matter of fact. Now, again, if we consider ourselves, and most of us perhaps live in Kingston, now we have a water problem, as Dion referred to earlier, right across the country. Now, Kingston, in terms of the domestic water supply, is provided through, and I think the estimate is about 40%, through water coming from the Hope River that goes into the Mono Reservoir and the Yalas River. So the Hope and Yalas rivers, as part of that watershed complex, is important for its management because we get our water supply from that area, and so whatever is done, the activities, the farming practices need to be such that their impact on the area is minimized so that the land and the forest that Mr. Henry spoke about can provide its function to support the sustainability of the flows coming through on the rivers. So it's important, and I think in the context of our discussion and the experiences that we've been having over this past couple of weeks with the drought and the heat, no less important. Now, there are some terms that we're all probably a little bit familiar with, some of our students in particular. So we've had the discussions about ecosystem-based approach, integrated coastal area management, integrated water resources management, you'd have probably heard about that as well, integrated watershed management, the ridge to reef, as a question for H2O, we can relate it to that, sustainable land management, water resources management. All of these terms we use. Now, I just quickly want to refer to a couple significant projects, interventions in some of our watersheds over the last 5 to 10 years. There was recently the integrated management of the Yalas Hope Watershed Management Area project that was funded by the IDB to the tune of over $6 million US, where we had interventions up in that area. I'll speak back to that. The ICAM project out in Drivers River, the JA Reach up in Swift River in Portland, and the Hills to Ocean project that's presently running. Now, the Yalas Hope, I spoke to that earlier, is critical. A lot of activities take place in there, a lot of farming, coffee farming, other types of agricultural activities. Again, critical that this area is managed. Now, the project had significant intervention in those areas. Over 500 farmers were engaged and trained in best practices. Over 550 hectares of land were reforested. We had a project aimed at looking at payment, what we call payment for ecosystem services, and a number of other activities in that watershed. We had some positives, and one of the metrics is in terms of sediments coming from out of the watershed area. We have noticed a decrease in that, and that's a good sign. So the project had some success, but the activities need to be sustained given the critical nature of that and importance of that watershed. Another area is the Drivers River watershed, which is out in East Portland. There we had a number of interventions, again, a pretty nice, decent watershed, very healthy, high forest cover. But again, we were engaged with the community in a number of activities. J.A. Reach looked at, and this is a USAID-funded project, looked at supporting livelihood, small business activities within the watersheds, because these are areas that people live. But the idea fundamentally is that we have to somehow strike a value balance to support the conservation while allowing for livelihood and livelihood-related activities. Hills to Ocean is another project that's intervening in the Wagwater River, Rio Nueve and Rio Breno watersheds. Again, that's heavily focused on working with communities, working with farmers, and of course, having the input from our sister agencies, Forest Department, RADA, WRA. We've had some deliverables to date, but we expect that for these watersheds, we'll be seeing significant improvements because of these interventions going forward. Some of the watersheds have been defined as critically endangered. Some are considered to be healthy. And right now, as an agency, we're targeting those watersheds that we consider to be very impacted and need to be rehabilitated and restored. All right, I think I'm going to stop there, and then we'll have further discussions as we go on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now, I promised you the answer was in Mr. Mackenzie's presentation, even though he didn't say it explicitly. So let me see if you can pick it out. Now, throughout the virtual town hall, there are some abbreviations you're going to be hearing over and over. I just want to remind you, when you hear WMU, that's Watershed Management Unit, and that's like the basic building block. That's what we're talking about in terms of at the management level. Let's go now for an overview of the policy itself. And as I mentioned, some of your comments and questions coming in already, and we expect to have many more coming in now during this overview. And we'll welcome Tony-Ann Miller. She's Director of the Natural Resources section of the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation.
Good evening, everyone. I am Tony-Ann Miller, Acting Director for Natural Resources in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. Today, I will be presenting on the Watersheds Policy for Jamaica Green Paper. This is being done to elicit your views on the policy, and it will inform the finalization of the policy. The principal objective of the Watersheds Policy is the sustainable and integrated management of Jamaica's watersheds. In this regard, the policy addresses institutional and legal frameworks, and this is for more effective management of our watersheds, taking into account the relevant policies, Vision 2030, and the SDGs, which are the Sustainable Development Goals. These definitions have been covered by the presenters before. I think one is their watershed area. So the watershed area is an area declared as such under Section 5 of the Watersheds Protection Act. A healthy watershed provides a variety of ecosystem goods and services, including food, fresh water, habitat. A healthy watershed also provides opportunities for recreation and ecotourism. A healthy watershed is better adapted to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Mr. Marshall outlined the 26 watershed management units. So we'll move on. Some of the issues affecting our watersheds are illegal logging, unplanned development, charcoal burning, improper disposal of solid waste, agricultural runoff, and groundwater contamination. We are guided by the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, and the policy, which is a watersheds policy, is aligned to the tenets of Vision 2030 and several policies, including the 2023 Climate Change Policy, the National Land Policy, and the Policy for Jamaica's System of Protected Areas. The 2023 Climate Change Policy was approved as a white paper in March 2023, and the National Land Policy, as well as the Policy for Jamaica's System of Protected Areas, are currently being updated. The principal legislations for the effective management of our watersheds are the Watersheds Protection Act, and you probably see me referring to that as the WPA, the Natural Resources Conservation Act, the Forest Act, the Water Resources Act, and the Rural Agricultural Development Authority Act. The vision of the watersheds policy is that Jamaica has healthy and optimally functional watersheds that are efficient and effective in the provision of ecosystem services for the benefit of all. The policy has 5 goals, and these are for the effective management of our watersheds. These are developing comprehensive legislative and institutional frameworks, providing adequate and sustainable finance mechanisms, increasing access to data and information, ensuring that Jamaicans are aware of the importance of watersheds and are active participants in their conservation, and promoting sustainable land management. The schematic shows the institutional framework for the implementation of the policy. We have the Natural Resources Conservation Authority, and they'll be required to establish a Watersheds Protection Committee at the national level. And this committee will have representatives from various ministries, departments, and agencies, as well as community-based organizations, civil society, and non-governmental organizations. We will also have the establishment of subcommittees at the parish level, and this is to engage community members. We have an integrated water resources management council, which is currently under the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, as this is where the water portfolio is. Next, we move into the objectives. The policy has 5 objectives. Objective 1, rationalization of legislative and institutional frameworks for watershed and water resources management. a strategy under Objective 1 is for the Watersheds Protection Act to be amended. So this act is a 1963 act. So it will be amended to include the definition of a watershed, as well as to provide details about the establishment of the subcommittees. Objective 2, updating the National Watersheds Management Program and provision of adequate human and technical resources for the implementation of the program. The strategies under Objective 2 include the establishment of the Watersheds Area Management Mechanism, the WAM, as a code of practice for watershed management. A national program will also be developed and implemented, and this is to train persons in watershed management. Objective 3 focuses on financing. It states that the adequate and sustainable financing will be provided for watershed management. Some strategies under that include the implementation of a payment for ecosystem service scheme, which Mr. Mackenzie referred to earlier. Other funding options will be explored and implemented, and these include the allocation of a percentage of the cost of major projects in upper watersheds, such as highways. Other funding options that will be explored include the allocation of a percentage of the cost of water bills and irrigation charges. And this is for rehabilitation projects in the watersheds as well as for conservation purposes. Objective 4, increased availability of appropriate information and data for effective watershed management. An activity under Objective 4 is the revision of the Watershed Management Unit 1999 classification system. So this classification system needs to be revised. Implementation strategies under Objective 4 include increased capacity to conduct research and exchange information, and using drone technology for the monitoring of our watersheds. Objective 5 focuses on increased public education and awareness initiatives, and this is geared towards positive changes in attitudes to watershed conservation and the promotion of public participation in the planning of watershed management interventions. Activities under Objective 5 include developing strategies and materials for public education and awareness, as well as creating a public education program which is focused on the importance of watersheds, and this is to be used in schools. Objective 6 focuses on sustainable land management, and some of the activities under Objective 6 is the determination of existing sustainable land management practices, supporting the systematic land registration program, and undertaking assessments to determine the core areas for watershed protection. The policy has an implementation plan as well as a monitoring and evaluation framework. The policy is available on the websites of the Ministry, the National Environment and Planning Agency, WRA, and the Forestry Department. You can also access it at your regional libraries and the municipal corporations. If you have access to it, the implementation plan is on page 42, and it outlines the objectives and provides more details on the strategies, the activities, indicators, timeline, agencies, and cost associated with the different activities. The monitoring and evaluation framework can be found on page 52. It outlines the expected results, the proposed indicators, targets, means of verification, and the methods for data collection. The monitoring and evaluation of the policy will be carried out by the ministry with responsibility for the environment biannually. Thank you for your attention. Please send all comments to ermb@megjc.gov.jm by July 31st. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Miller. And we are now jumping straight into your questions, your comments, so do keep them coming in. As I mentioned, we've had some before, and joining us on the panel now we have Chief Technical Director in the Ministry, Ms. Gillian Guthrie. Now, I'm going to just start out with two questions, and then after that I'll start throwing to your question. So my first question has to do with Objective 1, which is the section dealing with the legislation. I think this might be for you, Ms. Guthrie, but of course, anybody on the panel can comment or contribute to any issue. So, as Ms. Miller mentioned, it's a 1963 Act, and the legislation itself doesn't really speak to management issues. Section 8 in the Act gives the authority the power to make regulations, and the regulations would deal with things like crops, how crops are grown in the watershed management units, the land use in the area, as well as cutting trees. I don't see, at least in the body of the policy, the issue of regulations mentioned, although the various acts that are going to be reviewed are mentioned under implementation. Can you tell us where, if at all, the issue of the regulations would fall?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. Thank you very much for that question, and good evening, everyone. Okay, so what has happened is because since 1963, a lot of other pieces of legislation have been promulgated. So we have the NRCA Act, we have the Forest Act, we have the WRA Act. And many of these pieces of legislation cover many of these things that we are speaking about right now. The idea is that we're going to review the Watersheds Protection Act in keeping with the policy once it's approved, but not to allow for duplication. We're trying to streamline the act in keeping with the existing pieces of legislation. So we are not necessarily going to be having the level of regulations that we have intended under the 1963 Act, because they already exist under the Forest Act, the NRC Act, or the WRA, or even the RADA Act. So what we're going to do is to try to amend the Act to put in first some definitions, some terms are missing out of the legislation, and we're going to also put in the institutional framework that is being proposed that Ms. Miller already spoke to. And we're also going to look at a more streamlined governance arrangement and how it is that we put in law the engagement of the communities in watersheds management, local governance in the watersheds management. So those are the key issues, but the idea is not to duplicate things which have happened already since 1963.
You mentioned local governance, so let me just pick up on that issue, because this might fall under Objective 1 or 2, but I notice that the policy speaks to asking the municipal corporations to include watershed issues in the parish development plans. Should we, though, be looking at management plans developed specifically for each watershed management unit, developed in conjunction with community representatives? And I ask as well against the background of the fact that in a former life, and I worked in national parks, an important part of park management are the development plans that you put together in association with the community. So should each management unit have a management plan?
Yes, the idea is that each management unit will have a plan. And the idea also is to ensure that the community-based organizations have an active role to play, not only in the development of the plan, but also their implementation. So the idea is to make sure that that role that the community-based organizations and local governance will have in watersheds management is enshrined in the legislation going forward. So the idea, though, is to make sure that with the streamlining of the legislation, streamlining of the processes, we put a more targeted focus on the community-based interventions, because we recognize that it is at the community-based level that we will get the most input the most proactiveness in terms of how it is that we protect and conserve our watersheds.
Okay, this one now for you, Mr. Marshall. Emma is asking, how do you calculate or measure groundwater levels, and is this something that would be reflected in the policy?
Groundwater levels are measured using probes, where you take a probe and you put it down. There's an electronic sound, and when it hits the water, you have a beep. So you measure the distance from the top of the measurement point down to where the water, where the probe touches the water. And that is reflected in the Water Resources Act. You calculate the elevation of the groundwater above sea level, and you look at looking at the Water Resources Master Plan in terms of the details, which are pretty technical to get into here. But basically, the changes in groundwater elevation will indicate the changes in groundwater availability and storage in the aquifer. As I stated, the watersheds is mostly defined by surface water drainage, and I mentioned the fact that in terms of groundwater movement, there may be times where the groundwater is traveling across the surface water divide that you might see on the surface. You see something different on the ground. So the policy itself, I would not expect to reflect too much on groundwater, but it does impact in terms of the fact that what happens on the surface, it does infiltrate into groundwater, and that will have an impact in terms of the overall water balance. So while it is not a direct part of the watershed policy, it is indirectly impacted, and the Water Resources Act and what we do at the WRA would be the more specific measurement and management of that resource.
Okay, this one now from environmental economist Dr. Peter Edwards. I don't know if this one is for Ms. Guthrie or Ms. Miller, because I know you mentioned the financing issue. But Dr. Edwards is asking, he says, my main question is whether the policy indicates sustainable financing as a key area and emphasizes potential PES schemes. However, he says, I'm not seeing an obvious connection to the polluter pays principle. And he's asking whether the government is considering increasing or putting levies on riverbed gravel and sand mining interests to help fund upper watershed protection and management.
Okay, so one of the things he mentioned is in the policy. So we did mention the PES, the Payment for Ecosystem Services, and this is where beneficiaries are required or asked to pay those who conserve and preserve the watershed. So those farmers, for instance, who must be incentivized to do sustainable farming practices, and those who are users of the resources from watersheds would then pay for those services. So that's one of the things that is inside there. We don't have levies included in it, so if that is a recommendation, then that could be considered. We do also talk about in the policy in terms of sustainable financing other issues in relation to fees that may be charged by some regulatory agencies that have a role to play in watershed management. We may we're recommending that a percentage of those fees go towards watershed management. We're also recommending, as Ms. Miller said in her presentation, something on your water bill, possibly to also contribute to preserving and protecting our watershed. So we have a mix of things in the policy, but we're open to other ideas, because sustainable financing of these types of issues. And remember that watersheds are huge areas with many, many factors in them. Many issues affect a watershed. So we're always looking for creative, innovative ways to sustain financing to restore, rehabilitate degraded areas, for instance, and to maintain those which are healthy so that they can continue to provide the goods and services that we all depend on.
On that same note, Dr. David Smith from UA is asking whether the PES Payment for Ecosystem Services scheme is yet in operation.
No, it's not in operation, but it did come out of a project that NEPA implemented. Mr. Mackenzie can say more about it. And in fact, we have had public sector stakeholders go to other countries where the pest is showcased. I think they went to Costa Rica and Colombia, where those countries have the pest in operation. So we have been studying those interventions in those respective countries to see what are the best practices that we could possibly utilize here in Jamaica. But we have not yet operationalized it, but it is in the policy as a tool for sustainable financing of watershed management areas. But I don't know if Mr. Mackenzie would like to say anything more on that.
Right. So, this is a definite way that we'll be proceeding. I think after we've finalized on this policy and it's been agreed on, and for all practical purposes, it's indicated there, we have already completed significant studies and assessments relating to the pest. We have a document to be tabled in cabinet as soon as we've gone through this process, so that we can move that process forward. Certainly, and as Ms. at CTD indicated, I think one of the practical areas that we're looking at is how, in terms of the water as a ecosystem service, how the true value of that and how that can be replicated back as beneficial use and beneficial impact to watershed users. I say that in a general way because we have to agree on the approach, and that is what will be tabled through the ministry to cabinet. But the point is that we've done substantial work in that regard. We have a key colleague here, Andre Reed, who has been involved in a lot of that work so far.
Okay, Mr. Henry, this one for you from blogger and environmental advocate Emma Lewis. Will you be highlighting management, she asks, of the new quote-unquote type of forest that is secondary forest, and what are the methods you're looking at there?
Thank you very much for that question. The designation of a secondary forest class is that happened in the last elaboration of the land use land cover classification. We recognize that the secondary forests exist primarily because of a reduction in agriculture in some places and other similar factors, and that has facilitated some regrowth. The forest management plans, which I had mentioned in my presentation, are a key means by which we look at how we can achieve sustainable forest management. And we do that in collaboration with communities, as has been mentioned by the other presenters in the context of watershed management generally. So it is through those documents that we would be looking at identifying means and ways of doing that protection, that management.
All right, Mr. Mackenzie, this one now for you. This one from me. Listening to your going through your presentation and as well looking at the whole area of environmental management, a lot of the work is project-based, as we all know. You know, we get some donor funding, we set up a project, we do something for 2-3 years, project money run out, and then what happens next? And especially with the emphasis in this policy on sustainability, how do we move past the project type of approach to incorporating a more sustainable ongoing program approach?
Right. So a couple of things. In terms of how we are set up as an institution, I had indicated in one of the slides the various approaches to watershed management, integrated watershed management, ecosystem-based approach, and so on. So from a programmatic point of view, we have restructured the agency to have specific focus on some areas, including watershed management. So we have bolstered that particular area, recognizing its importance with additional staff. So the Yala's Hope project that I referred to, before the project ended, a sustainability plan was prepared. And it's that plan that we are actually implementing to ensure that what was done by, yes, a lot of money over a set period of time, but that you have it going forward and taken on board as a program going forward. So for example, I want to use a very practical example. And I don't know if you can recall, back in 2015, 2016, we had significant fires during the drought period. And I mean, the droughts were not as extensive or dry period as it is now. That probably can be corrected, but during that time, we had a lot of fires up in the Hope area, up in Mavis Bank, and so in fact we had a significant fire that impacted the area for days, millions of dollars, right? But I'd like to suggest that because of the intervention of that project, despite the fact that we're having extended droughts and dry periods, we don't have the amount of fires that we had during that time. And we've been recording and we've been tracking that. So we have seen the impact, and in terms of its sustainability. We have to be engaged on the ground. We are putting regulations relating to open burning for fires, and we expect that, as we have done with sensitizing the farmers, the people who live up in the watershed, that this aspect of fires would be minimized despite the drought condition. Because fires, in my mind, right now, in this dispensation, will have the major impact on our watershed, despite everything else, and in spite of. Thank you.
So you're saying you think we're getting there?
I think we have an approach, and if we look at the experiences in other countries right now with fires and so on, I think we've been fortunate, and perhaps we can contribute that to some of the action that we have taken.
Okay, so Mr. Henry wants to come in, and I'd love Ms. Guthrie to comment on that as well, because sustainability, I think, is going to be so key here.
Thank you, Dean. I do think sustainability is a key part of the discussion, and in support of some of what Anthony has said, the Forestry Department was actually a key partner in the Yellow Slope project, for example, and I think it is through building that kind of partnership that some of the sustainability will be achieved. The Forestry Department, having facilitated the replanting of some of those areas, actually has incorporated the maintenance of those areas into its annual program of works. And it is through activities like that that we are moving towards sustainability through a joined up government approach.
Yes, so this is the whole idea. So the watersheds policy that we're doing is to set the framework. It is to set the governance framework, the institutional framework that will allow for that sustainability. So while we have projects that we have done, and it was deliberate that we asked NEPA to share with the public the interventions that have been made from a projectized approach. But the idea is that the benefits derived or the outcomes of those projects, now we are going to go into mainstreaming those projects into legislation where it is appropriate, into governance framework where it is appropriate, into looking at the institutional framework where it is appropriate, looking at the engagement strategy that we have with the local stakeholders. All of that is to ensure the sustainability going forward. So this is an exercise that we are doing, moving from the project approach to a more sustained long-term approach involving all stakeholders.
Question from the Jamaica Environment Trust. I think this might be for you, Mr. Marshall. Jet says, we see the presence of limestone/karst soil is mentioned in the policy, but it doesn't seem to include restrictions or guidelines for these important areas of water recharge in the watershed.
The Water Resources Act does provide a condition for the protection of water quality, formation of water quality control zones, and that can be looked at in the Act in terms of the steps to do so. So again, that would be from that perspective of protecting the land in that area, and that would require, of course, dialogue and communication and collaboration between all agencies on board here. As it relates to the watershed policy under discussion here now, don't know if Ms. Guthrie would have more to comment on that part. What I can say is that there is a facility for that protection to happen, and of course, the WRA continues to provide feedback on the development approval process and other such things, providing education to the state public stakeholders as to how best to protect water resources in that particular aspect. When it comes to the karst nature of the soil and of the land, of the underlying geology, etc., it's a multidisciplinary approach that will be needed for that, not just one agency.
Does it sound, though, as if it's worthwhile perhaps taking a look at whether there should be specific mention of that in the policy?
I think it could be worth considering, yes.
All right, I have another question from Dr. David Smith, and he is asking whether there are special provisions for protecting watersheds of tourist attractions such as YS Falls, Somerset Falls, Reach Falls, or Dunn's River, and if not, why not, and should there be in the policy?
Okay, so we don't specify any particular watershed area, but it is always understood that the agencies that have a role to play in the management, so the WRA, NEPA, Forestry, for instance, they would prioritize the watershed management unit that we need immediate intervention on. So, for instance, when Mr. Mackenzie talked about the Yallah's Hope had degraded areas. It needed urgent attention. So through this project, we were able to make some interventions. So within the regulatory agencies, there is a recognition of which watershed management unit requires urgent attention. And so from a collaborative approach, the agencies will work with the local stakeholders to address the watershed issues in that particular area. So we don't have, they used to have in the past classification of these watershed management units, degraded, severely degraded, etc. They have moved away from that. There's going to be another criteria used for classification of the state of these watersheds. So that is something that NEPA and others will be working on. And based on that, those criteria and the classification, then that will have allow for that collaborative approach with the local stakeholders to look at the intervention. So we don't specify in the policy any particular watershed management unit, but it is understood that those which are severely degraded would get prioritized for interventions by the agencies.
Would it be worth doing that, though, specifying it so that, I hear you speak about the collaboration and it's understood, but does it help to have it put down in black and white where, everybody can see it and everybody knows at a glance what the priorities are?
Well, we're open to that because the policy also has an implementation plan. So we can look into the implementation plan. That implementation plan is activities which must happen within a 5-year period. So if the agencies, after having discussions with the key stakeholders, determine that a particular watershed management unit requires this collaborative intervention, then that we can possibly put in our implementation plan and cost those interventions. Yes, so that's something that we could look at.
Question from Shakira Green asking about the WAG watershed, saying, are there any changes to the boundaries? And if so, what are the reasons?
It's an interesting question. I can share that the WRA and NEPA have begun dialogue about updating the watershed boundaries. And so that dialogue is there. It's ongoing. More than that I can't say right now, but it is begun and will be ongoing. So we'll be hoping to answer that question soon and very soon.
Well, perhaps more generally, though, what are the factors that would cause changes in boundaries?
The most significant factor would be increasing the technology of resolution, that you can more accurately define the boundaries in terms of the surface divides. That would impact the boundary of a given watershed. For example, in the past, and Forestry can speak of this more in terms of remote sensing, you might have had resolution of about 30 meters from the satellite imagery, and these days it can go down to up to 6 meters or even 1 meter or sharper. And so the sharper the resolution, the more accurate you can define the boundaries from the topographical divide. In addition to that, WRA has been performing dietary studies that will look at the impacts of sinking streams and where they rise, and that also provides more information as to where you might have had just as topographical information, but now you're looking more at where you've seen for sure where a sinking stream rises, and therefore that will be contributed into that watershed. So more technology, more information would lead to a revision of the boundaries from the hydrological perspective.
Okay, so increasing technology then is helping to identify the correct boundaries more accurately. Would that be right?
Well, it helps to provide the boundaries more accurately, as opposed to saying the boundaries aren't incorrect, they're just being more precise now with increased technology.
Got you. Thank you so much. All right, so here's another question from me. Let me ask this to Mr. Henry. The whole issue of the fact that only 24.5% of forest cover or forests are under the control of the Forestry Department, and yet forests are so critical in watershed management. How is that going to be managed? How do you deal with that differently so as to protect and how does that feed into the policy?
Well, from the Forestry Department standpoint, we approach the current percentage of the forests that are under our management through various means. we have an active program to encourage privately held private landowners who hold a large portion of the forests to come on board to work with us to be more sustainable in their activities, and in some instances to actually have them designated as forest reserves or forest management areas. In addition to that, we work with the NLA. The NLA was mentioned in
National Land Agency.
Yes, in my presentation, specifically because they're a key partner in terms of providing additional areas both for reforestation as well as to provide us with areas that are currently forested, that are not under our control, that can be added to the portfolio.
Another viewer asking whether watershed management was taken into consideration when the highways were being built. This viewer saying highways help to destroy the watersheds.
Well, I think, to answer that question, when we consider the proposals for roads, coastal roads, highways, certainly the environmental resources and environmental factors weigh heavily in the decisions and the determinations. So I recall, for example, again, just being practical, the north-south highway that would have crossed, I think, two major hydrological basins, 3 watershed units. Yes, we had to give specific considerations there. The impact on the forest cover was examined, and there were conditions and decisions made in terms of reforestation in relation to the removals that was necessary for the construction. So yes, we had to, forest cover was taken out, but plans were established with the forestry department for replanting, so there was some compensation that was put in place to compensate for that loss and that impact.
And going forward, more generally, in terms of the policy, how is the policy going to speak to that kind of balancing act that has to be done between development and infrastructure development and watershed management?
Yeah, so there's an objective about land use. And following up on a point that was raised earlier, the forest cover is critical. And in the agency's work as it relates to land use, you know about the development orders and areas of growth centers and so on. So in our approval process and in the planning set of activities, we ensure, and we try to ensure, that developments occur in a focused area. And so that you will not have a major subdivision taking place up in the Oak River Basin, right? The focus of housing development ought to be in the metropolitan areas, in the growth center areas. So we're talking about increasing densities primarily because we don't want people to be in the watersheds, right? The watersheds have a purpose, and that purpose must be people must live in areas that are so designated, in cities, in townships, right? And not for us to have activities and developments all over the place. And that is the area of focus for us.
And that will be so even when the big money people come and want the fancy development up on the hillside in the watersheds, in the beautiful watershed areas.
No, most definitely. We have that challenge. Right? We have that challenge, but we have to be clear in terms of our objectives.
Okay, we still have some questions coming in, trying to get in as many as we can before we have to wrap. Another viewer asking about bauxite areas which were dug up and helped to erode the watersheds. What are the plans in place? Does the policy deal with that issue of mitigating those issues?
So the policy generally talks about remediation of our degraded watershed area. So it doesn't matter if it is bauxite mining or other types of activities which have an adverse effect on the watersheds. So just as we said, the policy is going to complement, because what viewers when Ms. Miller made her presentation, she showed you other policies which are complementary to what we have. So for instance, there's a forest policy that is already promulgated. So the watersheds policy will complement those existing ones, and it will speak to where we need remediation, reforestation, rehabilitation of degraded watershed areas. So those will be put in there specifically. We know that bauxite mining is one such area, and so that would possibly be one of the key focus of priority intervention by, as I said before, the collaborative approach by the regulatory agencies and the local stakeholders.
I think this is Chico Green asking about the issue of residential construction on the hillsides. Are these properties being approved with watershed oversight, looking at things like water movement and sewage?
Right. So speaking from the agency's point of view, meaning NEPA, the approvals that are issued by the agency take into consideration the suitability of the areas from an environmental point of view, from a geological point of view, from a risk management point of view. And I'm just answering this question generally. There is a hillside policy that was prepared that guides the development on hillsides. And I'd want to suggest that in the approval that we issue, we're guided by that policy. The bottom line is that Jamaica as an island is exposed to a wide range of hazards and risks. But we have to manage those risks, and I think that's the approach that we're taking.
Okay, I learned something today. I did not know we had a hillside policy. I am going to go and look that up. Thank you so much for that, Mr. Mackenzie. Follow-up question from Dr. Peter Edwards. He says, as per Mr. Henry's reference to joined-up policy, does the watershed policy explicitly provide connections to the Ministry of National Security for enforcement of breaches? And asking about both the police and the judiciary in terms of fines and sentences and so on.
Okay, so in the policy it does speak about fines, and most times when we do legislation and looking at enforcement activities, the JCF, for instance, is always mentioned as part of the enforcement regime. So if you look in the Forest Act, NRCA Act, you will see that the JCF, for instance, is part of a primary part of the enforcement officers of those pieces of legislation. So when we come to the amendment of the Watersheds Protection Act, a similar approach will be taken. So when we'll be looking at increasing fines, because it's from 1963, and we'll be looking at the enforcement regime. Who are those key stakeholders who must work with the regulatory agencies to ensure that the enforcement of the Act, once amended and streamlined, is effective? So I'm sure the JCF will be part of that regime.
Dr. Eric Garraway asking, he says there's quite a lot of importance being placed on community involvement. Does the policy include the establishment and strengthening of community groups?
Yes, so, and that is good, because one of the things that we did put in the policy is to have a watershed protection committee at the local level. When Ms. Miller made her presentation, she made mention of that. But we, in empowering the community-based organizations and the local governance arrangements, we will have to do some capacity building, we will have to do some technical assistance, we will have to do some sensitization. So there is a program that will have to be rolled out at the local level to ensure that the community-based organizations are fully seized with their role and the importance of watersheds management. So that is part and parcel of all the things that we will have to do when we have finished the policy and are moving to implementation.
Any thinking in terms of how to wrap in experience, because we have so many different types of committees, the parish development committees, as I mentioned, when we established the national parks first, the Montego Bay Marine Park and Blue and John Crow Mountain, there were management committees for those as well. And I mean, my experience working with the national parks is that these committees start out like gangbusters, you know, meeting every week and everybody excited. And then, you know, as the weeks and the months go by, especially when a lot of the intractable problems just come back on the agenda week after week after week, people kind of get fed up and then interest trails off. So any thought in terms of how to keep those community groups active in such an important area?
Very good question. It's something that we will have to grapple with, but we are believing that if we put in the institute, in the legal framework, the importance of local communities in watersheds management, so we infuse that in the legislative framework, that will help to sustain and probably elevate these groups in terms of their role. So that's part of what we're going to do. But I think if we continue to engage them on the ground, so we are imploring the regulatory agencies, and they also have their groups that they work with. The forestry department has their local forest management committees, NEPA has their environmental NGOs, etc. So these groups, the regulatory authorities will have to continuously engage them. We will have to put them and their role and functions in the legislation to cement that. And to continuously engage them in the process and to sensitize them and to build their capacity. I think once we do all of that, it may be much better in terms of sustaining them going forward. And just to say that when we talk about these community groups, we don't necessarily need to create any new groups. Where groups exist already and they're active, we will also empower them to help in watersheds management.
Okay. Let me ask another question on the legislative review issue, because the policy speaks to a wide range of statutes that have to do with watershed management. But in terms of the legislative review, it mentions the NRCA Act, obviously the Watersheds Protection Act, the RADA Act, the Water Resources Authority Act, and the Forestry Act. Are the other pieces of legislation going to be reviewed, though, in terms of, for instance, wildlife protection, flood control, solid waste management, which would all seem to really be important in the context of the policy?
Yes, because it is such a complex issue, this matter of watersheds management and multifaceted. So yes, where legislation has an impact on watersheds management, then we will take a look at. What we have done in the policy, though, is to signal those pieces of legislation that we have to tackle first. So we will have to tackle the NRCA Act, the Forest Act, the Water Resources Authority Act, the RADA Act, to be sure that when we streamline the Watersheds Protection Act, it doesn't duplicate, but also complements what already exists. So we are going to deal with those first, but it doesn't say that the others, like the National Solid Waste Management Authority Act, etc., will not also be reviewed in keeping with the streamlining of the legislative framework.
I know you have set out an implementation schedule, but implementation, as we know, is one of our weak points. What is going to help to drive that, to ensure that we do, in fact, not just have the paper, but actually put it into action?
Yes, so that is also a very good question. So what the idea is that once the policy is approved, and this will be the authority then for the, the regulatory agencies and others to have a role to play. So we want now the regulatory agencies, for instance, to put it in their operational corporate plans. We don't want it to be something separate. It's something that is part of their work. So these things that we're putting the watersheds policy, we want them to be infused in the operational and strategic business plans of the regulatory agencies. And we also want now to go to the local levels, talking to the municipal corporations, talking to the parish development committees, and also to infuse this watershed management recommendations in the policy at that level. So we'll have to have a discussion with them, those tools that they use and they respond to, how we can infuse some of the recommendations coming out of the policy into those documents that they respond to as well. So the idea is to not let it be something separate. We want it to be something, a part and parcel of what people do, the regulator, what they do at their desk and what we do at the local level.
How do you, and I know public education is one of the objectives that you're looking at here in terms of raising awareness. How do you how do you link, for instance, one of the viewers mentioning the photographs of dried up Somerset Falls? How do we link those kinds of realities to an understanding that this is watershed management?
Okay, so that's also another good question. We want to, and the minister said it through his speech. We wanted to Jamaicans to recognize the role that watersheds play, the ecosystem, goods and services that they provide. So watersheds are important for climate change regulation, for climate regulation. They're important for preserving our water resources. And so when we go to speak to the population about different matters, we need to infuse that issue of watersheds. It is because of watersheds that you have the quantity and quality of water. It is because of good watersheds management that you regulate the climate. It is because of watersheds management, effective watersheds management, that we have the biodiversity that we have. So when we go to speak about other things, we will have to now speak and make the link between watersheds management and this thing that you see in front of you, the benefit that you are that it provides to you. So we have to make that link, and we have to make it explicit that the ordinary Jamaican can understand and appreciate.
If I meant to make watershed sexy. Yes. So, Ms. Miller, I don't know if you want to say this because someone is asking for a reminder of the email address to which comments and questions should be sent, and perhaps also giving people a sense of how they can participate and contribute to this.
Okay. Okay, so comments can be sent to the ermb@megjc.gov.jm email. So what you can do is go through the policy and indicate any ideas that you may have or comments that you may have, and send them to our email at ermb@megjc.gov.jm by July 31st.
Does ERMB mean anything? Because it's kind of hard for people to remember.
So ERMB is our Environment and Risk Management branch. So that's why we have ERMB.
Okay, that might help. All right, let me take final comments, and let me ask you, Mr. Henry.
I'm sorry, I thought you were going to ask me a question or something. In terms of final comments, just to say that obviously the link between forests and watersheds is inextricable. The fact of the degradation in the watersheds is something that's been of concern to us. The National Tree Planting Initiative, which we are in the final stages of doing now, which aim to plant 3 million trees, is one of those critical steps that we can take as everyday Jamaicans to ensure that we benefit from a healthy environment. So from the Forestry Department, go out, plant some trees and help us to get not just to that target, but to ensure that going forward we actually have the benefits that we're talking about in the context of the watersheds policy.
Mr. Mackenzie.
Thank you. So in this present dispensation with the climate crisis, there is no better focus on building the country's natural resilience than focusing on ensuring that our watersheds are healthy. Our watersheds and upper watersheds is the interface between our atmosphere that generates the clouds that allows for precipitation into the catchment. Our healthy watersheds would allow for the absorption and the gradual percolation of that water to become available for our use. And as Mr. Henry said, the forest cover is critical. So in this present situation, as a country, I'd like to invite our focus on watershed protection and watershed management.
Mr. Marshall.
Thank you. I endorse what my other colleagues have said. I wanted to also say that remind us that water doesn't come from a pipe. And we've seen it in these recent times where the availability of water has become very important. And we're reminded, that Ms. Guthrie said, that the watersheds are the source of the water that we have, and everything is connected. One thing that you do here has an impact on the water availability further downstream or at some point in the future. So it's for all of us to really protect the watershed. By protecting the watersheds, we protect our water resources. And the WRA believes that this policy is indeed a very good step towards ensuring the sustainability of our water resources for years and generations to come.
And Ms. Guthrie.
Yeah, so the whole idea of the watersheds policy is to have action on the ground. So we are imploring all stakeholders, all Jamaicans, to first be educated about the watersheds. You live in a watershed, what is your role that you have to play, and see how you can get involved. The idea of the policy is not to write a document and put it on the shelf and tick a box. We really are hopeful that we will have a framework that will allow all of us to work together in terms of preserving and conserving our watersheds, because we recognize the importance that they play in lives and livelihoods. So we are really imploring all Jamaicans, if you don't know, call us, contact Forestry, NEPA, WRA, other regulatory agencies. Get informed and partner with us in trying to ensure that we protect and conserve the island's watersheds.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to end by reminding you once again of the email. You can send your comments and your questions to ermb@MEGJC for Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation.gov.gm. And for those of you who are saying, me can't remember that, I'd suggest you just look up the ministry on social media and drop them a message there, and I'm sure you'll be able to get all the information as well as the email address and also information on the watershed policy as well as a link to the actual policy which you can find online. Want to thank all the guests. Want to thank, as always, you for watching. Make sure you continue to participate in this very important conversation. I'm Dion Jackson Miller. Have a great evening.